Hi everyone, welcome to the VFX Futures podcast. I'm Ian Fales from Befores and Afters. Today is a special sponsored episode of the podcast from Cinesite, part of their 30th anniversary celebrations. I'm talking to Cinesite's Head of Assets and Visual Development, Madeleine Scott Spencer, about Cinesite's art department. We talk about how Madeleine got started in the industry herself, about the tools of the trade for art departments, some key projects and key challenges, including The Witcher Season 2 and Wheel of Time, and about a new dawn in the visual effects art department at Cinesite with the advent of virtual production. Stay tuned for the chat, it's really fun, and also on beforesandafters.com we'll have a post with some art department imagery and more information about where you can find details about the visual effects art department at Cinesite. Let's jump into the chat now. Hi Madeleine, how are you?
Great, thanks. How are you doing?
Good. I think we just established that you and I had met several years ago in Melbourne at a Ideas on Design festival.
That's right. That's right. Small world. We did. That was a fantastic time. Really inspiring and quite cool. I remember I had come over with some folks from Noman, and we'd done some presentations and some talks and met a lot of fantastic people. So it's great to run into you again.
Yes, and now you're, have I got this title right? Are you the Head of Assets and Visual Development at Cinesite?
That's correct. So it's basically art department and the asset pipeline, which for reasons which we'll talk about, we tie together quite closely. It's been my experience that the concept design art department pipeline and the asset pipeline can overlap quite a bit, and doing so it's pretty efficient, really great way of working.
Yeah. Before I ask you, Madeleine, about how you got to where you are today, you know, one thing that I pick up a lot from interviewing visual effects artists and talking to studios and then talking to people outside the industry is they don't always realize that visual effects studios these days tend to have art departments. I mean, I think in the scheme of things, they sometimes think these films and TV shows have their own concept artists and art departments and production designers. But of course, so much gets designed, you know, at the visual effects studio level. I wonder if you can just give me a bit of an insight into actually how Cinesite's art department and setup works.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes people think about the client side art department, the production designer, and that's obviously still very much a part of the pipeline of getting something from idea to screen. But visual effects studios came to the understanding early on that it was beneficial to have a standing art department. And sometimes that would take the form as you would rely on your assets artists to put on a concept hat when needed, which I think is great. Everybody really likes doing concept, but it's not always the best solution, because concept and modeling and texture painting are different disciplines. Not to say that people can't do both, but it's important not to conflate being an excellent texture painter with being an excellent conceptual texture painter. So what we do is we've set up an art department with dedicated concept artists, as well as a large number of artists who cross over, meaning they have their skill sets blend into the asset pipeline. So they could have been coming through the asset, sculpting or texture painting world. They came up as texture painters or modelers, but had a strong understanding of visual language and interpreting an artistic brief, being able to take a brief and then spin off from that and ideate from it, which is its own set of skills. And it's something that can be like all skills, they're fostered and they're built upon and improved upon. And so we foster that. We have artists that are able to pick up a creature from the beginning of the project. And typically everybody knows, everyone's in a situation where you've got a character, you've got a creature that's in the pipeline that's already established, but the client isn't quite happy yet with the concept. They don't feel like it's quite finished. And so we've created our visual development and assets department to counteract that tendency towards what I call concepting in pipe, where you try and address the client's needs by trying variations in Mari or trying variations in the model with a full render. It's not effective. It's extremely expensive and slow. So we just take a step back and switch gears and move back into a concept pipeline where we're taking ZBrush and Photoshop and done some targeted training with the texture painters to illustrate how to take the painting techniques that they understand from Substance or from Mari, and then just apply those in Photoshop and think about ways to leverage color theory and various color harmonies and referencing, aquatic skin patterns or fur patterns, fur tracks, and come up with quick ideas to place in front of a client, and then narrow down that view and get a sign off on something that takes a day or two to turn around and get approval on, rather than putting out, here's another turntable, here's another turntable. So that's in a nutshell kind of the inspiration and the idea behind it.
Yeah, awesome. And I think people would be really interested in how you got there as the head of assets and visual development, Madeleine. I mean, I remember seeing your Gnomon reels and, things that you shared early on with especially creature designs and creature work. But tell me a little bit about your own history in terms of how you got there to Cinesite.
Well, I've lived and breathed monsters my entire life. I started out as a makeup effects artist before I even went into digital. I was working as a sculptor and a painter for a makeup effects studio, and then decided, well, I think I'm going to go to art school, because some of the people around me, I think they had like an arts education, and they spoke a language I didn't quite understand yet. They would speak things like value and saturation, and they had a structured vocabulary for things that I think other artists had come to intuitively or come through by experience. It's like, I think there's some value to this. And I had a creeping feeling that digital was going to maybe be a big thing. I think that was right.
Yeah, I think it was.
So I went away to school, and and then ZBrush came out about the time I was in school, and I was like, I was an inch away from just changing majors, because it's like everything I loved about sculpting and painting was not readily apparent in 3D yet. You modeled with nervous patches, or you did very primitive box modeling and painting of bump maps. And ZBrush came around shortly before I ended up graduating, and I seized on it because this was something that allowed me to use everything that I had already learned as a sculptor and a painter. I could apply it directly into the computer. And so that, as you said, led me to doing, I was working at Gentle Giant Studios in Los Angeles, which, was actually the place that I sought out, because I didn't really want to go into a major VFX studio. I wanted to go specifically to Gentle Giant because I saw them as a sculpture studio that worked in polygons and pixels and clay and wax, and it was surrounded by sculptors and people that were thinking in terms of sculpture and thinking in terms of paint, and then sort of set up their digital wing, their digital sculpting and concept department there. And then one thing led to another, and through that time I was teaching at Gnomon and developing the ZBrush. They were DVDs then, and I still struggle to call them DVDs. Ache myself. People are like, what's a DVD? the video training, the workshops, which I still do. The workshops. I love teaching. So it's a big part of what I do and who I am. A big part of why I like managing as well. It's sort of touches that same teaching sort of thrill. So for me, it's very similar. Not that I'm teaching my career. My career is really very, very, very experienced, but it's just in the terms of assisting everybody to get to the highest possible level. So yeah, from there going to Weta, workshop, working Weta Workshop, still kind of doing physical and digital, doing concept as well as some painting and fabrication, and then took the full leap over going to Weta Digital about 5 years after that. So it's been almost a decade in New Zealand. And then when I left Weta Digital, I came to London and was at DNAG for a while and served in a role at DNAG. Was sort of an artist who straddled between their build department and their art department, because there was this disconnect where concept would be created, potentially even in ZBrush, and then it would break down when they were trying to get it into the assets pipeline. So they would have a great model, but then it would be turned around and it would be, the scale would be off, pieces would be broken off. People didn't understand how to maybe, effectively feed it into the pipeline. So there'd be a bit of a stagger start there, a stutter step. And so the idea was just to make sure that we were utilizing the strengths of all these tools, not becoming very, very careful not to have people preoccupied with the technical aspects of it, that the technical limitations drive the design, but just being aware of how to seamlessly take that ZBrush sculpt or that environment, and then feed that those digital elements that we get as a byproduct of a digital design of like a virtual art department, feeding that into the assets pipeline so it goes very, very seamlessly. And so I left DDAG and came to Cinesite and was working on the concepts for Witcher and Wheel of Time and a couple other shows, and it just naturally came together. It's like, we need a proper art department, but it needs to be very organically tied to the assets pipeline, not in the sense that one ever limits the other, but the sense that they both leverage their strengths and make things flow back and forth quite freely, so we can very easily respond to client changes if they are not happy with a design and they only voice that 3 months in, or if we start out and we're doing the design from the outset, making sure that we're able to generate elements that can be picked up in the pipe.
And actually, you mentioned one of the projects I wanted to ask you about, which is The Witcher, especially this recent season 2. Cinesite did a couple of the creatures. I love the Basilisks in particular. Can you talk about, what the design challenges of those were?
Yeah, those are such fun. There's 3 of the Basilisks. There's Basilisks. There were more at the beginning, actually, but by the end there were 3. There was the Basilisk White, Basilisk Blue, and Basilisk Black, and each one of them showing different degrees of kind of degeneration. So the first thing that happened when I came in, so the Basilisk, the head designs weren't really nailed down, whether or not it was a viper head or cobra head, the scaling patterns, and there was really fantastic work that had already been done in the model by artists before me. Royston Wilcox had done beautiful scales on the model. And what we needed to do was determine what the head structure was going to be. And not only just in isolation, what, let's say, the Basilisk White's head would be and the Basilisk Blue head would be, like how they would play together, because they would share screen together. And so we wanted them to fit nicely. Also, a big part were the feathers. So they all had feathers, and this is where you come into the situation where you're concepting in the pipeline. So I mean, Groom is an exacting and intensive process, and trying to conceptualize a Groom in the Groom pipeline would be very, very frustrating for a lot of the artists involved. So we just took a step back and I said, well, let's take a look at the shapes of these feathers, and let's get these sort of established before we ask the Groom artists to replicate, to create this. So we just thought about ways of making those shapes sort of weaponized. Like I wanted all the shapes on the basilisk to feel weaponized, either literally or figuratively. I wanted them to feel angular or like dangerous. And the feathers at the beginning had this sort of soft curve, fluffy feel to them. It's like that shape language is wrong. That curve and that downiness is telling you it's a newborn chick. It feels soft. They all have to feel like not literally little razor blades necessarily, but they need to feel like little blades. And so actually went out and I've got a whole bunch of reference materials here, just natural history reference materials. Like looking at reference, I went out and picked up some feathers off the side of the road and just literally cut them to the shape, distressed them, laid them down and scanned them and made a series of feather brushes for Photoshop, painted it into the concept. And then I was able to actually give those alphas directly to our groom artist and help to create the shapes, the profiles of the individual feathers using those.
Yeah, they're amazing creatures. I wanted to pivot to the other show you mentioned was Wheel of Time. Was that a show which was less creature designs and much more about the magical one power and, gentling and all this sort of thing? That seems to be a completely different kind of design concept art department challenge.
Yeah, the considerations for magic and sort of particle based entities like machine shin. We did a lot of passes on that, and that's where it's great to have the sort of team that we do. We've got people who are more pipeline facing, who have the experience of working in the model pipeline, and then folks who are more accustomed to painting simulations, painting magic, painting storms, painting clouds, these sorts of things. And so I was able to rely on a couple artists who could go in there and sort of see what does this look like if within this environment every little piece of dirt, every little piece of dust is caught up in a windstorm, and then it becomes suggestive of an entity but is not necessarily a tactile solid entity that you can see. So we do one of my favorite things to do are mood boards at the beginning. So I pulled a lot of mood boards on murmurations of sparrows, where you've got these undulating forms, this flocking behavior of sparrows, where they're moving through the air almost like a liquid or a solid, but they're all those individual little birds. And so we were trying to sort of use that as an inspiration. And it is a far cry from sort of the regular creature that you would think of in terms of like the Basilisks or the Chernobog. And it's something that, it's really fascinating and really important to get the right artist to do that sort of thing, which is not me. I don't usually do. I've never focused in on sort of magic and particle based work. I've always focused in on solid creature and character. And so it's always great to be able to find people who are really adept at that and can create those types of images.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing, Madeleine, is that you mentioned, being around at the right time for ZBrush and having a lot of practical experience, then the digital experience, and now in more of a managerial role. It does always feel, doesn't it, like the visual effects industry is changing all the time. And the newest change seems, of course, to be headed towards virtual production, real time, LED walls, volumes. I wondered how that was impacting directly on your role and the art department at Cinesite.
We are really excited by some of the things that it makes possible, like showing client work in a VR in situ scenario. Someone can experience their turntable in the presence of their turntable, which is a really fantastic tool to be able to have. We're very lucky to have a couple artists who are very focused on Unreal and have one who's exclusively Unreal, another artist who we're working with. We're putting together this I call it sort of like virtual showroom, where we can go in and look at characters in scale with one another in situ under kind of a North Light studio sort of environment, or in like a dungeon environment, just to get that feeling of what it would be, which can be really telling. But also, of course, you always do need to see something on screen too, because your perception of the scale of something when you're standing in front of it is going to be different than seeing it on a screen with the other characters. Also, we're utilizing 3D printing as well. just to be able to take our preliminary models, print out maquettes of them, and have that physicality when client comes into the screening room. It's nice to have those physical maquettes available, have the ability to look at those and handle them and see them in relation to one another. Because it's one thing to have a wedge of scale that you can show on screen, but it's quite nice to actually be able to physically see your protagonist and antagonist together and on a table. And that's where we all started anyway, playing with our monster toys.
Yes, I love it.
But yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh, only that I was going to say the other thing is I feel with visual effects studios adopting much more virtual production workflows is, and I guess the art department has always done things up front in any kind of pipeline, but it now feels like the visual effects itself has to be sorted out a lot earlier if it is going on to, LED walls, or if it is part of the scouting process or whatever. Has that directly impacted, your role and the way things are done? Given that I guess the art department is always there early as much as possible anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that is the most striking about the advent of the virtual art department is over like the past, I would even say like 5 years, the visual effects art department, like what is expected in an art department, has changed so much. Like when I was at Weta workshop, it was all purely just painting and these evocative paintings and illustrations and these beautiful scenes. And now it's a full pipeline at the beginning of the pipeline. You'll have quick and dirty groom or feathers, or your model potentially even in moving around in a scene. It's a miniature pipeline at the start of the pipeline. And you're right, it can actually have the knock-on effect of needing to shift thoughts forward about visual effects. But I think it can also answer so many questions so early on, especially because you can dedicate a smaller team, a very agile team, to creating very, very high quality results right at the outset. So you can answer questions and see potential problems that wouldn't have come out until well into the rig and into the animation, for example. It's like, oh wow, that armor plating doesn't work, or that's going to be a real problem. You can spot those and correct those well ahead of time, which is so much different just in the past, I'd say, like I say, 5 years, 6 years, 7, somewhere around there. It's changed immensely, and the expectations changed immensely. It's just, I look at portfolios now, and from a perspective of creature design, I'm looking for people that show a strong ability to sculpt and do Photoshop paintovers and overlays, and show an ability with Unreal, and show an ability with Maya or even Blender, a variety of different tools. That's just changed so much since just a collection. I say just a collection, but a selection of compelling illustrations. But ultimately, all of it is most important, just a clear understanding of shape language and design, which is what I was calling back to what I was saying earlier. It's like, it's one thing to model and sculpt and make creatures and ZBrush and paint over them, but it's another thing to do that with a very clear consideration of what emotions you're trying to evoke and what your shapes are doing and how you're communicating visually with the audience. That's a big part of design that's not often explicitly talked about, because people can become so enamored with the tool, or so enamored with the oh, look at this wonderful thing we can sculpt. But you have to be thinking always about the language we're speaking, which is the language of shapes and abstraction. All design is essentially graphic design. Where no matter what, we're basically making logos. And I say that as somebody who hated my graphic design classes in uni. But that's what we're making. We're making logos in motion. And what is a logo? It is an icon. It's a sigil. It is an image which is designed to become impacted and stuck in the mind. It's iconic. It's designed to be iconic. And that's something that you just can't replace. You can't skimp on that. You can't. No amount of technological bells and whistles will ever make up for something that's poorly executed in terms of its overall silhouette.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned the kinds of things that you tell new artists now, because that's something I was going to just finish up and ask you about, Madeleine, especially in the context of the art department and Cinesite's art department and its contribution to shaping stories. If someone wanted to get into very specifically visual effects art department kind of work, rather than necessarily be a compositor or an effects TD or something like that, is there anything you tend to say they should look out for, they should do, they should watch? What's your kind of advice there?
Well, I mean, I would say find the thing you want to do first off. I always tell
Yeah.
my students, when I tell my Noman students, like, don't worry about getting a job. Worry about getting the job you want, because
Mm-hmm.
if you've done the work, you'll be employable. But what is it you want to do, and focus in on that, and try and achieve a level of excellence in that particular thing. And then this isn't to say that you have to specialize to the point of being, you know. Myopic. I only want to do creatures. Well, that's great. If you want to focus in on creatures, then focus in on research in natural history. Look at the biomechanics of animals. Look into veterinary medicine. Not taking veterinary medicine courses necessarily, but there are anatomical things that you should really understand. Look at natural history illustrators and how they deal with fur and how they deal with things like that. If you're interested in doing effects and in concept for effects, and that's, focus in on understanding your illustration and perspective, even though your perspective is going to be done for you, quote unquote, by the 3D app. Understanding your cameras, your camera focal length, how much is actually going to be visible, the cone of vision, so to speak, how much you're actually going to see. All these sorts of things are going to come into play. So, I would find the thing that you're the most passionate about, and then expand from there, and passionately explore every element of that. And your work can only be, can only benefit from that. I think definitely understanding the tools is important. Be it Maya, be it Blender, be it ZBrush, Moto, whatever you happen to be using, but don't become so preoccupied in the tools that you become simply obsessed with technology.
Mm. I think that's great advice, and so thank you for sharing that. It's been really fun catching up and talking to you about all this stuff. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great talking, and definitely it was a wonderful chance to share some of the exciting stuff we're doing, and I really enjoyed it.